October 10th, 732 AD. Somewhere between the cities of Tours and Poitiers, in what the Romans once called Gaul and what the Franks now called home, the morning arrived the way all terrible mornings do. Quietly, without announcement, wrapped in a thin grey mist that drifted off the river and settled between the trees like something alive. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold earth, and the distant, lingering ghost of smoke from a city that had already burned. Bordeaux. It had been a city once. Now it was a memory and a warning. The warning had been travelling north for weeks. It moved on horseback mostly. It arrived in fragments. A refugee stumbling into a village, a monk fleeing his monastery with only what he could carry, a merchant whose cart had been abandoned on a road that suddenly became very dangerous. The warning said, "They are coming." The warning said, "They do not stop." The warning had been saying the same thing, in different languages, across 3 continents for exactly 100 years. 100 years. That number deserves a moment of silence, because it is not a metaphor. It is a measurement of something almost incomprehensible. 1 century earlier, the Prophet Muhammad had died in Medina, leaving behind a faith and a fire that his followers carried outward in every direction with a ferocity that the ancient world had never witnessed. Egypt fell. Persia fell. The whole of North Africa, from the Nile to the Atlantic coast, fell. The Visigoth kingdom of Spain, which had lasted 3 centuries and considered itself unconquerable, fell in 7 years. The Byzantine Empire, the direct heir of Rome itself, survived 2 sieges, but barely, and only barely, and everyone knew it. The Islamic armies moved like a storm that had learned to think, purposeful, relentless, intelligently directed toward every gap in every wall. And now they were here. Now the storm had a name, and the name was Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, Governor-General of Al-Andalus, and he had spent the summer of 732 doing what he and his predecessors had always done: advancing. His army had crossed the Pyrenees in the spring. They had broken the Duke of Aquitaine at Bordeaux with contemptuous ease. They had burned what was worth burning and taken what was worth taking. And now they were moving north toward the most valuable target in all of Western France, the Basilica of St. Martin of Tours, the holiest shrine in the Frankish world, stuffed with centuries of gold and silver and jeweled relics, sitting like an invitation in a city that had no walls strong enough to matter. Standing between Abd al-Rahman and that basilica was a single man. He held no royal title. He wore no crown. He was technically a civil administrator, the mayor of the palace, a position that sounded like a household manager, but had, over the preceding decades, become something considerably more dangerous. His name was Charles. His soldiers, who had fought under him for 15 years through campaigns that spanned from Frisia to Bavaria to the Rhine, called him something else. They called him the thing that he had proven himself to be, time after time, battle after battle, in every impossible situation where a lesser man would have retreated, and Charles had instead planted his feet and refused. They called him the Hammer. And on that cold October morning, with the mist still thick between the trees, Charles Martel stood on a wooded hill above the valley and looked south at the largest army that had ever threatened his world. And he did not order a retreat. This battle changed the shape of the Western world forever. Not because one man won one fight on one October morning, but because of what that victory made possible, and what that defeat prevented, and because of the long chain of consequence that runs from a misty hillside in Francia all the way to every nation, every church, every institution, every idea that we now associate with the civilization called the West. The wall of ice held. And the world that exists today was built on the ground where it stood. The speed of Islamic expansion in the century before Tours is one of those historical facts that sounds exaggerated until you look at the dates and the distances and realize that no, this actually happened, and the people living through it had no reason to believe it would ever stop. Muhammad died in 632 AD. By 636, Arab armies had defeated the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Yarmouk and taken Syria. By 642, Egypt was gone, the breadbasket of the ancient world, the province that had fed Rome for centuries, absorbed into the expanding caliphate within a decade of the Prophet's death. By 650, Persia, the great Persian Empire that had warred with Rome and Greece for centuries and considered itself the equal of any power on earth, had been broken. By 670, Arab fleets were threatening Constantinople itself. By 698, Carthage had fallen, and the whole of North Africa was under Umayyad control. And by 711, the army of Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with perhaps 7,000 men, and within 7 years had destroyed the Visigoth kingdom of Spain entirely. The Visigoths had ruled Iberia for 3 centuries. They had armies, they had fortresses, they had the memory of Rome behind them, and the mountains of the Pyrenees in front of them. None of it mattered. Their king Roderick died at the Battle of Guadalete before his kingdom had truly understood that the invasion was not a raid, it was a conquest. By 719, Arab and Berber forces were already in southern France, raiding settlements, testing the roads, learning the land. By 725, a Umayyad governor named Anbessa had personally led a column deep into Gaul, reaching as far north as the Vosges Mountains, within striking distance of what is now the German border. Understand what this means geographically. The Vosges Mountains are not in southern France. They are in the northeast, almost at the centre of the European continent. In less than 15 years from the fall of Spain, Islamic forces had penetrated so deep into what had been Roman territory that they were standing in the middle of the continent, looking around and seeing nothing capable of stopping them. Every established power had either fallen or retreated. Constantinople had held, but only just, and its walls were far to the east and not available to protect Tours. The Frankish kingdoms to the north were in a state of chronic civil war, ruled by kings who existed mostly on paper, while their administrators fought each other for real authority. The machinery of the Western Roman Empire had been rusting for 2 centuries. There was no organized European resistance. There was no alliance, no strategy, no agreed-upon plan for what to do if the armies from the south kept coming. There was only the question of whether anyone, anywhere, had the will and the capacity to stand in the way. The Frankish kingdom of the early 8th century was, in theory, a unified Christian realm ruled by the Merovingian dynasty, the bloodline of Clovis, who had converted to Christianity around 496 and established the Franks as the dominant power of post-Roman Gaul. In practice, the Merovingian kings of 732 were what historians would later call the rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. Young men of distinguished ancestry who sat on thrones, received ceremonial honours, and exercised precisely no power over anything that actually mattered. The real machinery of the kingdom ran through a position called the mayor of the palace, the major domus, which had started as a household administrator and had, through decades of political manoeuvring and military necessity, become the actual governing authority of the Frankish realm. Charles had been the mayor of Austrasia, the eastern Frankish kingdom, since approximately 718. He had gotten there the hard way. His father was Pepin II of Herstal, the powerful Frankish statesman who had unified the Frankish kingdoms under his personal authority. His mother was Alpeda, a woman of noble birth who was either Pepin's concubine or his second wife, depending on which account you read and which of Pepin's other relatives you were willing to believe. When Pepin died in 714, the question of succession became immediate and violent. Pepin's legitimate widow, Plectrude, decided that Charles, the illegitimate son, the one with no formal claim, was a threat, and she had him imprisoned in Cologne before the body of his father was cold. Charles was in prison for roughly a year. Then the civil war that had been building across the Frankish kingdoms exploded, and in the chaos, Charles escaped. What happened next tells you everything about who Charles Martel was. He walked out of a prison cell into a collapsing kingdom with enemies on every side. And within 3 years, through a combination of military brilliance and political ruthlessness that left contemporaries genuinely astonished, he had defeated the Neustrian faction at Vinci in 717, broken the Saxons, pushed back the Frisians, forced the Alemanni into submission, and established himself as the undisputed de facto ruler of the entire Frankish realm. He had never lost a battle. Not after Cologne, which was the one defeat of his career and which he seems to have treated as a lesson rather than a trauma. He was the kind of commander who studied his enemies before he fought them, who moved fast enough to keep them off balance, and who trained his soldiers to a standard that was unusual for the period, drilling them year-round in peacetime so that when the moment came, they did not freeze, they did not run, they held. But it was not only Charles who shaped the stage for Tours. On the other side of the Pyrenees, there was a man whose ambitions and abilities were, by every account we have, equal to the moment. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi had served in Al-Andalus, the Arab name for Muslim Spain, for years before assuming the governorship. He was not a reckless raider, he was a strategist. He understood that Gaul was not simply a target for plunder, it was the path to everything that lay beyond it. The road north through Aquitaine led eventually to the Loire, the Seine, the Rhine, and ultimately to Rome itself, which had not been properly defended since the Visigoths had sacked it in 410, and which now lay under the protection of a church that had armies of faith, but very few armies of iron. His campaign in 732 began deliberately. He crossed the Western Pyrenees in the spring with a force that contemporary sources describe in numbers ranging from the historically plausible to the obviously mythological. Modern scholars estimate somewhere between 10 and 30,000 fighting men, with a cavalry corps of perhaps 5 to 10,000 mounted warriors, supplemented by Berber infantry, who were effective fighters but lighter in armour and more suited to raiding than sustained engagement. Against the Duke of Aquitaine, this force was overwhelming. Urd, sometimes called Odo, had fought the Umayyads before. He had won, once, at the Battle of Toulouse in 721, when he caught an Arab force in a surprise attack that the sources describe as an ambush against an overconfident enemy. That victory had given him confidence he perhaps should not have kept. At the Garonne River in 732, the confidence dissolved. Abd al-Rahman's cavalry hit Urd's forces with such speed and such force that the chronicler of the Mozarabic Chronicle simply wrote, "God alone knows the number of those who died or fled." Urd survived. His army did not, in any meaningful sense. He fled north with whatever men remained, crossed into Frankish territory, and arrived at the court of Charles Martel with an offer and a humiliation. The offer was alliance. The humiliation was the price. Urd had to formally submit to Frankish authority. For a man who had spent years trying to maintain the independence of Aquitaine against Charles's pressure, who had in fact allied with a Berber chieftain at one point specifically to resist Charles, this was a bitter surrender. He had a choice between pride and survival. He chose survival. Charles had been watching the Umayyad advance for years. The raids of 720 and 725 had not reached his territory directly, but he had not been fooled into thinking they were someone else's problem. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his entire adult life thinking about military strategy, what the Umayyad advance represented. Not a raid, not a border skirmish, a systematic expansion that had in 100 years consumed everything it had touched. When Urd came to him in the summer of 732, Charles had already made his decision. The price was Aquitaine. The stakes were everything else. He called the ban the general military summons of the Frankish realm. He gathered his veterans, the men who had fought with him from Vinci to Bavaria, the hardened professionals who had been trained through 15 years of continuous campaigning to do one thing above all others: hold the line no matter what was hitting it. And then he marched south, carefully, avoiding the main Roman roads because he wanted to arrive without warning. And he chose his ground, and he waited. The ground Charles chose was not accidental. Nothing about Charles Martel was accidental. The region between Tours and Poitiers is rolling country, not dramatic terrain by the standards of the Alps or the Pyrenees, but varied enough, with its scattered woodlands and gentle slopes and narrow river valleys, to offer a man who understood its geography a significant advantage over a man who was advancing through it for the first time. The Roman road from Bordeaux to Orléans ran north through this region like a spine, and Abd al-Rahman was following it because Roman roads were still, in the 8th century, the fastest and most reliable routes through Gaul. They were also predictable. An army following a Roman road had limited options for maneuver. Charles positioned himself on elevated ground, with forest and brush in front of his lines. This single decision shaped everything that followed. The elevation forced any attacking force to move uphill. The trees and undergrowth ahead of his position meant that cavalry, which depends above almost everything else on open ground and the ability to build momentum before impact, would have to pick their way through obstacles before they reached his men. A horse that cannot gallop is not a cavalry weapon. It is a large, expensive, vulnerable platform. Charles had turned the terrain itself into a component of his defensive system. He deployed his force as what the Chronicle calls a wall, a dense, tight formation of heavy infantry, standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears extended outward at the angle most effective for stopping a horse. This was the Frankish shield wall, a formation that owed something to the old Germanic war bands, and something to the Roman legion, and something to 15 years of hard thinking about how to fight people who were better on horseback than you were. The men in the front rank were the best soldiers Charles had, veterans who had been in tight spots before and who had learned, through repetition and pain and the occasional near disaster, that the formation only works if everyone stays in it. His estimated force numbered between 15 and 25,000, though the sources are honest about their uncertainty. What is clear from every account is the composition. Primarily heavy infantry, equipped with iron chainmail, round shields of wood and iron, axes, spears, and swords. They were not elegant warriors. They were effective ones. The Frankish infantryman of 732 was the product of a tradition that valued endurance over speed, mass over mobility, the discipline of the group over the glory of the individual charge. Against them would come the cavalry of Al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman's mounted warriors were among the finest in the world at that moment. The Arab Khurasaniya, the heavy cavalry, armed with long lances and curved swords, protected by lamella armour that was lighter than Frankish chainmail, but offered surprising protection, had developed their battlefield doctrine over a century of constant campaigning across terrain as varied as the deserts of Arabia, the plains of Persia, the mountains of Khorasan, and the rivers of Spain. Their signature tactic was what later Arab military theorists would call kar wa far, attack and withdraw, attack and withdraw, wearing down an enemy through repeated shock rather than a single sustained engagement. It had worked against heavy Byzantine infantry. It had worked against the disciplined Visigoth cavalry. It had worked, with minor variations, against virtually every army they had encountered. The Berber infantry in Abd al-Rahman's force were different in character. Lighter, faster, accustomed to irregular terrain, effective in pursuit and raiding, but less suited to the disciplined mass assault. They were valuable soldiers, but they were not the weapon that Abd al-Rahman trusted most. He trusted the cavalry. He had every reason to. The asymmetry between the two armies was not simply numerical, it was conceptual. An infantry-based force, no matter how well trained, is fighting at a fundamental disadvantage against high-quality cavalry on open ground. The cavalry is faster, can disengage and re-engage at will, can strike where the infantry is weakest, and can, crucially, simply refuse to fight on unfavorable terms until the infantry has marched itself into exhaustion. This is why Charles had chosen ground where the cavalry's advantages were reduced. This is why Abd al-Rahman, looking up at the wooded slope where the Frankish army stood immobile, felt the first whisper of something unusual. He had never seen an army that just stood there. Every other army he had encountered had eventually come out to fight on ground of his choosing, or had tried to retreat in a way that exposed its flanks, or had broken from the psychological pressure of watching the cavalry mass for a charge. The Franks did none of these things. They stood on their hill, in their forest, and they waited. And the days passed. For 7 days, sources differ on whether this was 7 full days or roughly a week of intermittent skirmishing and standoffs, the two armies faced each other across the valley without committing to full engagement. There were probing attacks. There were cavalry demonstrations. There were moments when the Umayyad horsemen came close enough to the Frankish lines that individual soldiers could see each other's faces. But the Frank did not come down from the hill, and Abd al-Rahman did not order a full assault up the slope. The psychology of those 7 days is worth considering. Charles was winning them. Every day he stood his ground was a day Abd al-Rahman's army ate from supply lines that had been stretched thin by months of campaigning. Every day was a day the weather grew colder, which affected the horses and affected the morale of men who had come north expecting quick victory. Every day was a day Charles's veterans rested behind their shield wall, while Abd al-Rahman's cavalry milled around the valley floor, unable to do the one thing they were designed to do: charge and destroy. In the Frankish camp, on the last night before the seventh day, the fires were small and carefully placed in the trees so they could not be easily counted from below. The men who sat around them were not heroes in any conventional sense. They were not noble-born warriors with famous names or celebrated genealogies. They were Franks and Burgundians and Alemanni and the survivors of Eudes Aquitanians, men who had walked for weeks to reach this hillside and who understood, in the practical way that professional soldiers understand things, exactly what it meant that the army below them had destroyed every other force it had fought. They had seen the refugees. They had heard what happened to Bordeaux. A man sat near the edge of the tree line and ran a whetstone along the edge of his axe. Not because it needed sharpening, he had done this 3 times already, but because the motion was something to do while his mind worked through the night. Beside him, someone was murmuring what might have been a prayer or might have been a conversation, low enough that the words dissolved before they reached anyone else. The forest behind them was dark and completely silent. The valley below was not. The Umayyad camp glittered with firelight, spread across the flat ground like a city that had arrived from nowhere, and the distant sounds of horses and movement carried upward through the cold air. The man with the axe knew some of these soldiers below had fought from Spain to this valley without losing. He knew it the way you know about a flood, not as an abstraction, but as a thing that is specifically coming toward you. He also knew something else, something that was harder to put into words, but that 15 years under Charles Martel had hammered into the bone. The man standing at the top of this hill had never, not once, led his soldiers into a position they could not hold. He had never ordered a charge he had not already won in his mind before the feet moved. He had never broken. The whetstone moved. The prayer continued. The fire was small. Then dawn came, grey and cold, and the valley filled with sound. The sound of Abd al-Rahman's cavalry assembling for a full assault is something that the chronicles struggle to describe, and that no written word can fully render. Imagine 10,000 horses preparing to move, and the sound that 10,000 horses make when they shift from rest to readiness. The percussion of hooves on ground, the metallic complaint of tack and armour, the particular low thunder that builds before it breaks. It rose from the valley below the Frankish lines in the cold October morning like a physical thing, a pressure that moved through the chest before it reached the ears, and every man on that hillside felt it. The Umayyad cavalry had not moved for 7 days. When they moved all at once. Abd al-Rahman had waited as long as he could afford to wait. The season was late. The supplies were tight. His men were restless, as men who are built for movement always become restless when forced to stand still. More than that, Tours was visible from the right vantage point, or nearly so, and the Basilica of St. Martin stood there with all its accumulated wealth, and every day it went untouched was a day that wealth went uncollected, and the whole logic of the campaign went unrealized. He could not stay forever. He could not go around. The Frank was on the road north, and the road north was the only road that mattered. He gave the signal. The cavalry came uphill through the morning mist, moving at first at a trot that built into a canter, horses bunching together in the narrowing space between the trees, the lances dropping from vertical to horizontal, the riders leaning forward with the particular focus of men who have done this many times before, and who know, from long experience, that the moment of impact always breaks something. It always had broken something. Every wall of men they had ever ridden into had eventually given way. Some on the first charge, some after 3 or 4, but all of them eventually, in the way that all things give way to sustained, repeated, sufficient force. The Frankish line did not move. The first wave of cavalry hit the shield wall and broke on it, the way water breaks on stone, not stopping exactly, because horses are not water and the physics are more violent, but not penetrating either. The men in the front rank absorbed the shock through their shields, through their bodies, through the sheer mass of the formation behind them. Men fell. The noise was extraordinary, the crash of horses into wood and iron, the screaming that horses make when they are injured and that sounds nothing like what you might imagine. The human shouts that in battle become indistinguishable from each other and merge into a single continuous roar. The Umayyad horsemen who survived the first impact wheeled away, as they always did, and reformed and came again. The Frank did not move. The second charge was harder than the first, better coordinated, aimed at the points where the line looked thinnest. Arab cavalry broke into the outer edge of the formation, and for 30 terrible seconds, or perhaps it was a minute, or perhaps it was longer, time in combat does not move at normal speed, it seemed as if the wall might actually give. The men in the breach did not retreat. They closed inward, pushing against the breach from both sides, and the horsemen who had broken through found themselves surrounded by infantry rather than riding free in the open, and the advantage flipped instantly. Because a horse in close quarters with men who know what they are doing is a horse in serious difficulty. The line held. By noon, and the chronicles are not precise about timing, but they suggest the main engagement lasted most of the day, the pattern had established itself. The Umayyad cavalry would mass, advance, strike the Frankish line with everything available, and the line would bend but not break. The Frank would absorb the blow, close any gaps, and stand. Then the cavalry would reform and come again. It was the Ka wa Fa doctrine applied to a situation it was not designed for. Not a flexible enemy who could be worn down by repeated disengagement, but a fixed wall that simply absorbed each impact and remained. The doctrine required an enemy that would eventually crack under repeated pressure. The doctrine had never encountered an enemy that refused to crack. Hours passed. The mathematics of the situation was slowly, inexorably shifting. Every cavalry charge costs horses and riders. The Frankish line, holding its position on high ground with trees limiting the frontage of each attack, was concentrating the damage. The Umayyad cavalry could not deploy their full numbers on a slope broken by trees and undergrowth. They could only send so many horses uphill at once, which meant each charge was smaller than the force Abd al-Rahman actually possessed, which meant the ratio of casualties was moving in the wrong direction for the army that was doing the attacking. An attacking force that cannot bring its full weight to bear against a defending force that can concentrate all its defenders on a narrow front is an attacking force with a structural problem. Abd al-Rahman understood this. He was not a man who failed to see what was in front of him. He pushed harder, found the places where the line seemed weakest, committed his best cavalry to the deepest penetrations he could achieve. His horsemen were brave. The chronicles of both sides agree on this. They rode into that wall of iron and flesh again and again with a courage that earned them the name martyrs in the Arab sources that survived. But courage applied against a problem that is fundamentally geometric is still courage applied against a problem that is fundamentally geometric. The Frankish line was a shape that the Umayyad cavalry, with everything they had, could not break. Then the crisis came. Then the line actually bent. It happened in the late afternoon, when fatigue had dulled the reflexes of even the best soldiers on the hillside. A concentrated Umayyad charge found a point where two sections of the Frankish line met and pushed through. The horsemen driving a wedge into the interior of the formation, and for a long, hideous moment, the integrity of the whole defensive structure was in genuine danger. The men in the breach were fighting hand to hand with cavalry, which is perhaps the worst position infantry can be in, and the noise from that part of the line changed character, became sharper, more desperate, the sound of men fighting for their lives at extremely close range. Charles moved. He was not the kind of commander who directed battles from a distance, and this was not the kind of moment for distance. He and his personal guard pushed into the breach, fighting directly, and the sources that survive describe him cutting through the chaos with the specific purposefulness that his nickname implies. Not wild, not frenzied, but controlled, deliberate, applying force exactly where force was needed. Zoom back. From the hillside above, if anyone had the presence of mind to look, the whole formation would have appeared to shimmer. A momentary instability, a section that moved where the rest was still, and then solidify again as the breach closed and the line reconstituted itself. The Umayyad cavalry that had broken through found themselves cut off, surrounded, destroyed. The men who had held the edges of the breach came back together. The line held. But somewhere in all of that, in the noise and the blood and the specific chaos of several thousand people trying very hard to kill each other on a wooded hillside in October, something else was happening, behind the Umayyad army, in the direction no one in Abd al-Rahman's force was watching. Duke Urd had not been idle. The Aquitanian cavalry, which Urd had preserved when he fled from the Garonne because the flight was faster than any pursuit, had moved around the flank during the day. They knew this country. Urd had fought over these roads, in this terrain, for years. They worked their way south and east, away from the main battle, and they found what they were looking for: the Umayyad camp. The camp where months of campaigning had deposited an enormous concentration of plunder. Gold from Bordeaux's churches, silver from every settlement between the Garonne and the Loire. The accumulated spoils of a campaign that had stripped southern Gaul to the bone. The families of many fighters were there, the servants, the supply trains. The Aquitanians hit the camp from behind. The news reached the Umayyad battle line the way bad news always reaches armies in combat. In fragments, in rumours, in the particular way that panic spreads when it begins at the edge of an army's consciousness and works its way inward. A horseman at the rear turned to look, then another. Then a whole squadron detached from the assault and began moving south. Not in rout, not yet, but in the purposeful way of men who have decided that their property is more important than the battle in front of them. Then another squadron. Then the detachment became a current, and the current became a tide. From the Frankish line, it must have looked like retreat. After hours of charge and countercharge and the terrible grinding discipline of simply absorbing blow after blow, the army that had seemed inexhaustible was suddenly moving in the wrong direction. The signal moved through the Frank like electricity. Not jubilation, not yet, but awareness. Something had changed. The thing that had been impossible was becoming possible. Abd al-Rahman saw it. He tried to stop it. He rode into the current of withdrawing soldiers, shouting, commanding, doing the thing that commanders do when they are trying to reconstitute an army that is beginning to doubt itself. He was Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, Governor-General of Al-Andalus, the man who had broken the Duke of Aquitaine without apparent effort, the man who had led this army across the Pyrenees and through a summer of victory without a single defeat. He rode into the chaos. The Frankish soldiers who had been standing against the hillside for hours, who had absorbed every charge, who had held every breach, who had stood like ice through the whole impossible day, pushed forward into the disintegrating Umayyad formation. The spears found him. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, Governor-General of Al-Andalus, commander of the army that had crossed the Pyrenees to break the West, died in the chaos of a battle that had been going wrong for hours and had just finished going all the way wrong. He died fighting, which was consistent with everything known about him, and he died trying to hold his army together, which was also consistent. The Arab sources that record his death call him a martyr. Balat ash-Shuhada, the highway of the martyrs, is what they named the battle. He had earned that title in the most literal way available. With their commander dead, the Umayyad army did not so much retreat as dissolve. The organized withdrawal became a rout, became a disappearance. In the gathering dark of an October evening, with the temperature falling and the mist rising again from the river, the army that had threatened to swallow all of Western civilization turned and ran south towards the Pyrenees and the relative safety of Al-Andalus. Charles did not pursue. This was not timidity. This was not the failure of nerve that it might appear to a later observer who wonders why, with the enemy in flight, the Frankish general did not mount his cavalry and run them down. Charles had almost no cavalry to speak of. That was the whole point of his tactical approach. And he had spent enough time thinking about how the Umayyads fought to be acutely aware that a retreating cavalry force that suddenly found itself no longer being pressed might stop retreating and become a lure, drawing his infantry out of formation onto flat ground where they could be destroyed. The discipline that had won the battle, the refusal to break formation, the refusal to chase, was the same discipline that governed the aftermath. He pulled his men back to the high ground. Night fell over the battlefield. The sounds of the Umayyad camp continued for a while. The movement of horses, the voices of men in the dark, and then gradually subsided, and then fell into something that was not quite silence, but was close enough to it that the men on the hillside could hear the wind in the trees, and nothing else. In the grey light of the following morning, Charles Martel sent scouts south. The scouts found what scouts always find after a battle has ended, and the loser has decided to leave in a hurry. The evidence of departure. The Umayyad camp was there, the tents still standing, the fires burned to cold ash, the cooking pots left where they had last been used, the supply caches that had not been taken. What was not there was the army. Abd al-Rahman's force had slipped away in the night, moving south as quickly as men could move, leaving behind everything that could not be carried on horseback at speed. The camp followers, much of the plunder, the equipment of a campaign that had been abandoned mid-execution. Charles rode down from the hillside and walked through the empty camp in the early morning. The scene was the specific kind of strange that empty places have after they were recently full. The residual warmth of fires that had been burning hours ago. The food that had been set out and not eaten. The small personal objects that soldiers carry and leave behind when they run. He walked through it without celebration, because Charles Martel did not appear, from any account we have of him, to be the kind of man who celebrated. He assessed. He confirmed. He made decisions. The assessment. The Umayyad army was gone and could not be effectively pursued by an infantry force. The confirmation. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was dead. His body was identified in the camp, or in the immediate aftermath, depending on which source you follow. The decisions: consolidate, secure the area, make sure this was not a feigned retreat before committing to any further movement. The Frankish losses at Tours are reported in the chronicles at approximately 1,500 men, a number that historians treat with appropriate skepticism, since medieval battle casualty figures tend to be either wildly inflated or implausibly low, depending on which side is doing the reporting. And 1,500 is suspiciously precise. The real number was probably higher, though the nature of the defensive engagement, stationary, in prepared terrain, absorbing cavalry charges rather than pursuing retreating enemies, meant that the Franks had fought under the conditions most favourable to minimizing their own casualties. They had made the enemy do the dying. Umayyad casualties are even harder to estimate. The Christian chronicles report numbers in the hundreds of thousands, which is obvious mythology. Modern historians, working from the force sizes involved, suggest somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 killed. A serious loss for any army, but particularly damaging because the dead were disproportionately cavalry, which is the most expensive and difficult component of any medieval force to replace. Horses take years to train. Riders take years to develop. The Frankish infantry had spent a day systematically destroying the most valuable military asset in the Umayyad arsenal. The body of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi lay among the dead. The manner of his identification is not recorded with the specificity that some medieval chronicles provide. No identified by the gap in his front teeth detail, no particular token or distinctive wound. He was the Governor-General, known by his armour and his banner, and the men who had served near him. He was buried according to Islamic rites by those who could be found to do so. The Arab accounts that mention his death describe it with a kind of restrained grief that tells you he was genuinely respected by the men he led. Balat ash-Shuhada, the Road of the Martyrs. His name is on the list. The battlefield itself, that stretch of wooded hillside and open valley between Tours and Poitiers, fell quiet with the speed that battlefields always fall quiet after the people have left them. The mist came back. The trees stood where they had been standing before any of this happened. The river moved south toward the sea, with the indifference that rivers have always shown toward the human events on their banks. By the time word of the battle reached the major cities, Cologne, Paris, Rome, and eventually Damascus, the grass was already beginning to cover the ground where 10,000 men had died. Charles Martel marched his army north. He did not linger, because the fight, in a certain sense, was not over. Tours had stopped one army on one October day, but the ambitions of Al-Andalus did not evaporate with Abd al-Rahman's death. The machinery of the Umayyad Caliphate was still running. Caliph Hisham was still in Damascus, and the impulse that had driven Islamic expansion for a century had not been permanently reversed by a single engagement in central France. Charles understood this. The years that followed Tours would prove him right. In 734, 2 years after the battle, a new governor of Al-Andalus, named Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj, launched a campaign into Provence and the Rhône Valley that dwarfed Abd al-Rahman's effort in scale. Avignon fell, Arles fell, Lyon was sacked. Umayyad forces pushed so far into Burgundy that they threatened to cut Charles off from his Italian allies. This is not what the narrative of Tours as the definitive end of the Islamic threat in Europe would suggest should happen, but it did happen, and it required Charles to campaign intensively through 736 and 737 to push the invaders back out. He succeeded, with the help of the Lombard king Luitprand. But it was a close thing, in ways that the Tur mythology tends to obscure. By 740, the calculus changed. The Great Berber Revolt erupted across North Africa. The indigenous Berber population of the Maghreb rose against Umayyad rule in a rebellion so serious that it required the caliph to divert resources from every other frontier. Al-Andalus, which had depended on Berber manpower for its armies, was suddenly fighting a revolt among its own soldiers. The carefully maintained machinery of Umayyad expansion began to jam. Then, in 750, the machinery broke entirely. The Abbasid revolution overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate in the east, replacing the dynasty that had ruled the Islamic world since 661 with a new family that traced its descent from the Prophet's uncle. The last Umayyad Caliph was killed. His dynasty was destroyed. One surviving member, Abd al-Rahman I, fled across North Africa and eventually to Al-Andalus, where he established an independent emirate at Córdoba, technically continuing the Umayyad line, but no longer connected to the centralizing power of Damascus. The unified caliphate that had conquered half the known world in a century was gone. Charles Martel died on October 22, 741, almost exactly 9 years after the battle that gave him his permanent epithet. He was buried at the Royal Church of Saint-Denis, the same church where French kings would be buried for centuries. He had never been king. He had never held a title more formal than Duke and Prince of the Franks. But when his son Pepin came to deal with the paperwork of the succession, the man who had the genuine power was clearly understood to be Charles's heir. And in 751, Pepin III was anointed King of the Franks by papal authority, the first of the Carolingians to hold the crown in his own name rather than behind someone else's throne. Pepin's son was named Charles. History would know him as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and he would become, in 800 AD, the first man to be crowned emperor in the West since the collapse of Rome. The Holy Roman Empire that Charlemagne established would last in various forms for over 1,000 years. The nickname Martel, the hammer, attached itself to Charles at some point in the decades after Tours. The 9th century chroniclers are the first to use it with regularity, and they frame it explicitly in the context of the battle. He hammered his enemies, they wrote, as iron and steel hammer every other metal. They gave him the nickname with obvious intentionality, connecting it to the specific act of standing in the way of an advancing force and refusing to yield. A hammer does not give ground. A hammer does not negotiate. A hammer meets force with equal and opposite force, and the force that is the hammer does not break. The debate among historians about the true significance of Tours has continued for as long as historians have debated anything. And it is a good debate, and it is worth engaging honestly, because the honest version is more interesting than the mythological one. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, described Tours as one of the most important battles in the history of the world. The moment that decided whether the Oxford of his day would teach Christian theology or the Quran. Leopold von Ranke called it the turning point of one of the most critical epochs in world history. Victor Davis Hanson, in more recent scholarship, catalogued the long tradition of treating Tours as the high watermark of Islamic expansion into Europe, the moment when the tide turned. And military historian Robert W. Martin flatly called it one of the most decisive battles in all of history. The counter-argument has been made by Alessandro Barbero and others. The Umayyad force at Tours was a raiding party, not a conquest army. It had outrun its supply lines. Abd al-Rahman's objective was the gold of St. Martin's Basilica, not the permanent occupation of Gaul. Even if he had won, the argument goes, the structural problems of projecting sustained military power that far north of the Pyrenees would have limited what he could actually accomplish. The internal divisions that tore the Umayyad Caliphate apart in the 740s would have eventually done the work that Charles Martel did on that hillside, with or without the battle. Both arguments are true, which is the answer that most serious historians now accept. Tours was not, by itself, the unconditional salvation of Western civilization. It was a battle in an ongoing conflict, and the conflict would have continued even if it had gone differently. And the outcome of that longer conflict was shaped by many factors beyond what happened on one October day. The Berber revolt mattered. The Abbasid revolution mattered. The internal fragmentation of Al-Andalus mattered. But what Tours did, what it uniquely did, in a way that nothing else in that century accomplished, was establish that the expansion could be stopped. Every previous army that had met the Umayyad cavalry in open battle had eventually broken. The Franks did not break. The psychological effect of that demonstration cannot be measured in a spreadsheet, but it can be understood. After Tours, European commanders knew that the thing they had been afraid of could be withstood. The wall could be built. The line could be held. And it established Charles Martel in a position of authority that made everything that followed him possible. Without the prestige of Tours, without the legitimacy that came from being the man who had stopped the thing that had stopped everyone else, the transformation of the Frankish realm into the Carolingian Empire is not inevitable. Pepin's anointing by the Pope is not inevitable. Charlemagne is not inevitable. The specific shape that Western European civilization took in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries, the feudal system, the relationship between church and state, the emergence of the knight as the central military and social figure, none of it is inevitable without the foundation that Charles built. And the foundation that Charles built rested, in part, on the hillside at Tours. The Reconquista, the centuries-long effort by Christian kingdoms to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, began in earnest under Charlemagne, who established the Marca Hispanica across the Pyrenees and pushed the frontier back into what is now Catalonia. Barcelona was taken by the Franks in 801. The process that eventually resulted in the unification of Spain as a Christian kingdom was initiated by the man whose grandfather had stood on the hill at Tours. The armoured knight, the central military technology of European medieval warfare for 500 years, was, in a deeply ironic way, partly a product of what happened at Tours. Charles Martel's men had absorbed the Arab cavalry charge by standing still. But the people who watched that cavalry charge, and who studied it and respected its power even in defeat, understood that a mounted warrior in good armour, on a good horse, with good training, was an extraordinarily effective military tool. The Franks began to develop their own cavalry tradition in the generations after Tours, learning from the enemy they had defeated, and the result was the mounted knight who would define European warfare from Hastings to Crécy to the last flowering of the medieval military tradition. There is something fitting in that. The weapon that stopped the Islamic advance helped create the weapon that would shape Europe for the next 500 years. The hammer struck the anvil, and the spark became a fire. Centuries after the battle, the ground between Tours and Poitiers became farmland. Quiet farmland, the kind that produces wheat and sunflowers, and the particular soft light of central France in the late afternoon. The kind that looks like it has never been anything but peaceful. The town of Moussy-la-Bataille, the town of the battle, sits near what some historians believe was the site of the engagement, though no one is certain. Because certainty about an 8th century battle in a field with no permanent markers is not available. Tourists do not go there in large numbers. There is no spectacular monument, no battlefield museum on the scale of Gettysburg or Normandy, no annual reenactment with flags and period costume. The dead are under the soil, without ceremony. But the dead are there, and the world they died to defend, or the world they died trying to reach, depending on which side of the hill you stood on, is the world that exists today. Every institution, every border, every language, every church, every political arrangement, every philosophy that emerged from the civilization that Tours helped preserve has some faint thread, some long unspooled connection running back through Charlemagne to Pepin, to Charles Martel, to the moment when a man without a crown stood on a hill in October and looked down at an army that had never lost and said, "Not here. Not today. Not while I am standing." The hammer held. The ice did not break. And the world, for better and for worse, and for everything that has ever been argued about it since, kept going in the direction it was already going. Because one man, on one hillside, with soldiers whose names we do not know, simply refused to move.